Today, 22nd November, in the battlefronts in Ukraine, we continue to be in the season of the Rasputitsa, the autumn mud period, which has significantly slowed military operations all along the battlefronts. But weather indications are now strongly suggesting that that season, the Rasputitsa season, is coming to an end. Apparently last night, the temperature in Donetsk city was minus 10 degrees centigrade, in other words, well below freezing. Obviously, we are in a time of year when we will get periods of intense cold, followed by periods of thaw. We are not fully into the winter season yet, but we are coming very close to that point, and before long, the ground will start to freeze, the air will start to clear, and of course the temperatures will fall, and the foliage of the trees, by the way, will drop off as well. And the last is important because both sides in this war, but most specifically the Ukrainians, tend to use tree lines in order to camouflage their positions, and of course the fall in the foliage will leave those troops more exposed to the drone, artillery and missile strikes of the other side. And of course, in terms of drone artillery and missile strikes, the Russians now are obtaining an ever widening advantage. And we're going to come in a moment to discuss how the extent to which that advantage is indeed widening and starting to favor the Russians. But even though the Rasputitsa still prevails, the conditions of Rasputitsa still prevail, on two battlefronts, fighting does appear to be continuing, and in some respects perhaps even intensifying. The most important of these by far is Avdeyevka, and a cascade of reports started to appear yesterday, all of which spoke of further significant Russian advances around Avdeyevka, and even of a collapse of Ukrainian defenses in the southern parts of Avdeyevka, in the industrial areas to the south, and the surrounding fields and dacha belts and those areas. And Dima at the Military Summary channel has posted a video taken by presumably a Russian soldier in this area, and it shows Russian tanks rumbling through what look like devastated ruins. And he says that this is clearly, Dima says this is clearly taken in the southern industrial area, and that these tanks, and it's obvious even to me, looking at this video, seem to be unimpeded, unaffected. They're not concerned about anti-tank fire or artillery fire upon themselves. They're able to move about, trundle towards the Ukrainian lines, unimpeded by mines, artillery, or anti-tank weapons. And it does seem that there, at least in the south, in the southern parts of Avdeyevka, the area of the southern pincer, things are intensifying as well. There have been other reports from other sources about the situation in Avdeyevka, and they also appear to point to a deteriorating situation for the Ukrainian troops that continue to try to hold out in Avdeyevka. I saw reports about very heavy Russian artillery and airstrikes on Ukrainian positions in and around Avdeyevka. Supposedly, the Ukrainians tried to conduct a counterattack in the Stepovoye village area, which they were pushed out of. They were pushed out of that particular village some time ago, And there were reports fairly recently that the Russians had actually established a presence in part of that village, though one hasn't heard very much about that for some time. But anyway, the Ukrainians apparently did attempt a counterattack, but from what I've been able to understand, it was driven back. The Ukrainians suffered losses and had to pull their troops back. And the indications from Ukraine is that the orders which have been coming from Kiev is that Avdeyevka must be held at all costs, even as these pincers gradually close around the Ukrainian troops. I'm not sure whether they number 1 or 2 brigades in Avdeyevka, even despite the fact that the pincers around them are closing, even despite the reports that these soldiers themselves are becoming increasingly demoralized and disaffected. About a week ago, they actually published a video in which they, in effect, said as much. Despite all of that, they've been ordered to stand firm and to keep fighting, apparently until the bitter end. The purpose of this, I don't understand, but it is the same pattern that we've seen followed by Ukraine in repeated battles. It was what the Ukrainians did in the fighting in Mariupol, in the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in 2022, in the fighting in Bakhmut earlier this year, and it's now repeating itself in Avdeyevka as well. Now, I do understand the strategic importance of Avdeyevka. I also understand its symbolic importance as a small but significant town of 30,000 people before the war, close to Donetsk city, and in other words, representing to Ukrainians and to the world Ukraine's continued presence close to Donetsk city and its aspirations to one day retake Donetsk city, aspirations which, in my opinion, are now entirely delusional. But anyway, I understand its symbolic value, I understand its strategic value as the hinge, perhaps, for Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass. But nonetheless, given that its fall looks inevitable, I still can't see what logic is served by demanding that brave men continue to fight in Avdeyevka until the bitter end. If it was true that Ukraine needed time to build up its forces in the rear, to re-equip with new equipment, to obtain new supplies, to mobilize, well, then perhaps there might be some more logic in it. But, as we shall see, the reality, for the moment, is that it is the Russians who are building up their forces in men and machines, and doing so at an ever faster rate, and time, far from working in favor of the Ukrainians, now it seems to me at this point in the war definitely favors the Russians. And later in this program, I will come to an article which I've read in the National Interest, which says the same, and I will anticipate my further comments by saying that Richard Haass, formerly of the Council, I believe he's still a member of the Council for Foreign Relations, even though he's no longer its chair. Anyway, Richard Haass has now given an interview in which he says the same thing. So given that that is so, why are the lives of these men being sacrificed? What conceivable purpose does it serve? Anyway, I ask these questions. I never get answers to them. Nobody has ever answered these questions at any point in the war. Throughout the fighting that has happened, I get no impression that people in Washington or London or Brussels who might have influence over Ukraine have asked these same questions of the Ukrainian leadership in any meaningful way. On the contrary, as I discussed in my program yesterday, as far as I can see, the entire movement at the moment, the entire trajectory of thinking amongst Western governments and Western leaders, and indeed Ukrainian leaders as well, is to carry out a further, even more bigger mobilization so that more sacrifices like the ones we see in Avdeyevka can take place. Anyway, that's the situation in Avdeyevka. The other place where we're getting quite a lot of news now is from Kherson region. And again, Dima covered all of this pretty well in his latest program. Now I'm just going to make a few brief points. Firstly, it looks as if the Russians are gradually squeezing this bridgehead that the Ukrainians have established in Krinky. They're bombing it heavily. They're bombing it with cluster bombs now, as well as conventional bombs. They're also continuing to shell this bridgehead and launch these terrifying flamethrower rocket systems at this bridgehead as well. But there's also now information that the Russians have actually pushed the Ukrainians back from part of the bridgehead, that they've reoccupied some of the territory of this small bridgehead, squeezing the Ukrainian troops still in this bridgehead into an ever shrinking area. But Dima, at the Military Summary channel, absolutely correctly, published information about something completely different, and of that there is now no dispute because we can see lots of pictures of this. He provided video evidence of this. We see Russian drones, suicide drones, destroying Ukrainian boats, trying to send reinforcements and supplies and perhaps evacuate wounded soldiers from this bridgehead at Krinky, and perhaps attempting to land on other banks of the other parts of the east bank of the Dnieper. Anyway, we've seen pictures now of these drones, these Russian drones, striking these boats, and they're doing so at night, and they are being directed towards these drones by cameras with night vision equipment. Now, that means that the Russian drones are able to operate at night, and they are becoming, obviously, a major problem. That is becoming a major problem for Ukraine, because from what I can understand, Ukrainian reinforcements and supplies to Krinky have tended to be sent at night, when obviously the Russian artillery and air forces are less active, and the drones up to now have not been able to operate. Well, if this is changing, if Russian suicide drones are now being provided with night vision devices, then of course that is no longer the situation, and it's going to become much more difficult for the Ukrainians to sustain this operation in Krinky for very much longer, because their supply boats are now increasingly likely to be targeted by the Russians, both at day and by night. Now, Dima made the entirely valid point that if the Russians are able to provide night vision equipment to suicide drones, then that does suggest a huge increase in production by the Russians of night vision equipment. By definition, night vision equipment on a suicide drone has only one use, because the drone itself is destroyed on first use and the night vision equipment is destroyed with it. And of course, if the Russians are now producing industrially large quantities of suicide drones with night vision devices, then that by definition means that the Russians must be producing industrially or industrial quantities night vision devices, and that must be a major crisis point for the Ukrainians. By the way back at the start of the war, in February and March 2022, I remember many people in the West, many commentators in the West, making much of the fact that because of Western supplies of night vision equipment, the Ukrainians were much better supplied with night vision equipment than the Russians, and that put them at a big advantage in night combat. Perhaps that, by the way, doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Now, I am going to qualify what Dima said a little. Maybe, in fact, it is undoubtedly the case that the Russians have very substantially increased production of night vision equipment, and there is abundant evidence of this. We can see that more and more Russian troops, more and more Russian armored vehicles, and drones, surveillance drones, and such things are being equipped by this with this type of equipment. But it does seem to me at least possible, and perhaps even plausible, that what is happening on the Dnieper River is that the Russians are adapting specific drones, specific suicide drones with night vision equipment, and that this isn't the general pattern across the entire battlefronts. In other words, with Teplinsky now in charge, the Russians are improvising, and they're improvising intelligently. They're combining night vision equipment with their suicide drones, specifically on the Dnieper front line. Perhaps only a relatively small number of drones are being adapted in this way, but it is being done in a way intended to prevent the Ukrainians being able to send men and equipment back and forth from the West Bank to the East Bank. So perhaps that is the reality of the situation. But in a sense, it makes no difference. The fact is that the Russians are now able to destroy these boats with these Ukrainian soldiers and their reinforcements and their supplies at night. And that takes me back to what Shoigu was saying yesterday, and indeed the Russian Ministry of Defense was saying yesterday in their bulletins and updates, that the combat operations by the Ukrainians around the Dnieper are failing, and that all Ukrainian landing attack attempts are now failing as well. And the operative word was all, and it could be that what has made the Russians confident and explains why Shoigu and the Russian Defense Ministry made those claims is precisely the fact that these adapted suicide drones are becoming so effective in destroying these Ukrainian resupply boats. Anyway, that's the situation in Kherson region. I think there's been far too much attention given to this particular part of the conflict area. Dima says that the Ukrainians are probably planning a more ambitious operation along the Dnieper in December and January. He may very well be right, but he gave a number for the number of Ukrainian troops who will be involved in it, which is 4,000. And all I would say is that that is far from sufficient in order to achieve any significant breakthrough against the enormously strong Russian defenses in this area, and contrasts with the 40,000 troops that the Russians have concentrated around Avdeyevka and who are conducting their offensive there. Anyway, I mentioned Shoigu's statements about the situation of the Dnieper, and of course he has been talking also, and this is also coming now from the Russian Ministry of Defense, it's from the same board meeting where he talked about the Dnieper, the situation on the Dnieper. He's talking about the situation with military equipment. And he said this: the main task of this year was aimed at the operational equipping of the group of forces, this is the Russian military, with weapons, hardware, ammunition, and material. And I'm now reading directly from the Russian Defense Ministry's website. And he went on to say this: compared to the beginning of last year, he means the beginning of 2022, there has been a 4, 9, 3, and 16-fold increase in the scope of delivery of rocket and artillery weapons, armored vehicles, and unmanned aerial vehicles to the Russian armed forces, respectively. So if we just take a step back, he's saying that rocket and artillery weapons, that's multiple rocket launch systems, TOS-1 flamethrower systems, Iskander missiles, and artillery, that the number of those has increased fourfold. That's as compared with production numbers on the 1st of January 2022. He says that production of armored vehicles, that's tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers, has increased threefold. He then, has increased threefold. He says that production of unmanned aerial vehicles, of drones, has increased 16-fold. And then he says that there has been a 12-fold increase in supplying weapons and a 5-fold increase in supplying precision long-range missiles. So production is a 12-fold increase in supplying weapons. Now, it's not entirely clear what that means, but to me that looks like he's talking about ammunition. Now, maybe he's not just talking here about artillery ammunition, he might be talking about small arms ammunition as well. But anyway, a 12-fold increase in supplying weapons, and that, as I said, does look like ammunition, and a 5-fold increase in supplying precision long-range missiles. And that, obviously, he's talking here about the KH-101s, the Calibre missiles, and the Kinjal hypersonic missiles, and of course the Zircon missiles, which are also hypersonic, are now also entering production. And he talks about the fact that there's been significant increases in the production of weapon systems for the strategic forces, and he discusses at length the situation with the Navy, but he does eventually return to discussing the situation with the in the area of the special military operation, and he says that there's going to be an increase, a further increase in the number of ships operating in the area of the special military operation with calibre missiles. These are cruise missiles, and these will also be used, presumably, in the area of the Black Sea. Now, these eye-watering numbers, and for the record, they are in line with, very closely in line with the figures I was given by that person who has been writing to me, whom I've mentioned before, and who spoke about eye-watering increases in production on the part of the Russians in various categories of military weapons. So I think I said that it was a four-fold increase in rocket and artillery weapons. I'm going to correct that. Again, my eyesight's not perhaps particularly good. It's a 4.9% increase in such weapons, almost a five-fold increase, in other words, in rocket and artillery systems, a threefold increase in armoured vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armoured personnel carriers, and a 16-fold increase in quantities of drones, a 12-fold increase in ammunition, and I think this is what he means, and a 5-fold increase in precision long-range missiles, the ones that the Russians have been using earlier in the conflict zone, and which they're now busy stockpiling, who knows to what end. And clearly, there is no shortage of weapons on the part of the Russians. Well, perhaps I should qualify that. No doubt Russian military commanders would always like still more weapons than they're getting. But the fact is that numbers of weapons that are flowing to them are increasing in quantity all the time. And we have had so many reports now that the Ukrainians are starting to that their quantities of weapons, by contrast, are steadily running down. They're facing increasingly severe ammunition shortages, increasingly severe artillery shortages. They've not had new tanks supplied to them. Well, perhaps they're getting some T-72s, but no new Western tanks, apart from these Leopard 1s, for some time. And these are old tanks, the Abrams and the Challengers, about which we heard so much. Well, they've been supplied in limited quantities and they're being held back in the rear. And overall, the whole situation shows a growing discrepancy in fighting power. Now, the Ukrainians are saying that apart from Avdeyevka, they don't expect a big Russian offensive before the Russian presidential election in March. I think they would be extremely unwise to imagine, by the way, that the Russians operate in this kind of way, that they conduct their war according to timetables and political dates in the way that is fairly typical in the West and in Ukraine itself. But I too, as I've made it clear, don't expect that this Russian juggernaut, which is growing in scale and size all the time, is going to be unleashed over the winter. And the reason for this is simply that the Russians are still recruiting tens of thousands of men, 1,600 men a day, according to their claims. And they have shown that before they send men into battle, they work hard to train them, even if that takes many months, perhaps even a year in order to complete training, the training process. So, given that training takes time, I don't think we're going to see any big Russian offensive moves with these vast forces that are gathering this year or perhaps this winter. But of course, the Russians have already shown that they're prepared to conduct offensives in Avdeyevka, in Kupiansk, around Bakhmut, in the Vremivka salient area, that the Ukrainian forces are exhausted and becoming run down, that artillery is in short supply in Ukraine. So, though there won't be perhaps this big Russian offensive, another operation like the one in Bakhmut is already underway in Avdeyevka and might be concluded fairly soon. And the pressure on the Ukrainians is going to continue to grow and is going to continue to grow all the time. And Richard Haass gave an interview, I believe it was yesterday, it was a television interview, in which one could see that he was making finally what appeared to me to be valid points. He said, look, we can continue to supply Ukraine with more equipments, more weapons. We can continue to supply Ukraine with more resources. But given the battlefield realities, given the resilience of the Russian economy, given the fact that the Russian economy is now in the process of a boom, given that the ruble, by the way, has been strengthening again in recent weeks, as at the time of making of this program, I believe it's trading at 87 rubles to the dollar, below the 100 ruble mark, ruble to the dollar mark, which some people were getting excited about when the ruble fell below it earlier this year. Anyway, given all of this, throwing more equipment and more money at Ukraine is not going to change the situation. It might prolong it in some ways, but it's not going to turn things round. It's not going to resolve the situation or provide Ukraine with the resources it needs to change the direction of the war. The trajectory of the war is now clear, as it was, say, in the Second World War, around, let's say, the 1st of January 1944. The forces that were piling up then on the Allied side were growing in number. They were becoming overwhelming. German military production was increasing. The Germans were producing more advanced or acquiring more advanced weapons. But the reality was, whatever they did, they were falling further and further behind. And that is the reality of the war today, the war in Ukraine today. And Richard Haass said as much. And that is obviously good sense. But of course, he still appears to cling to this idea that there should be a freeze of the conflict, that there should be, in effect, a prolonged ceasefire with discussions about Ukraine joining the European Union, Ukraine getting security guarantees from NATO, all those sort of things. Well, we've had an article in the National Interest which takes all of these illusory ideas head on. And I have to say, yet again, it's striking that we see articles like this appearing in the American media. You won't find them to any great extent in the British media or to the European in the European media. In the United States, there continues to be more ability to discuss these questions, the question of Ukraine, and to do so in an intelligent and objective way, even in the mainstream media, than you will find in Europe. But anyway, this article in the National Interest, an extremely establishment publication, as I said, it's one of the big three of three publications of the US foreign policy establishment. Foreign Affairs is one, Foreign Policy is the second, the National Interest is the third. Anyway, this article is by Matthew Blackburn, and it has this title. It says, Ukraine War, Selling Stalemate and Prolonging Pain. Freezing the Russo-Ukrainian war with a fight and talk approach may be more challenging than its proponents appreciate. Anyway, the article begins with a very interesting comparison of the difference between this conflict and the Korean War conflict. And it says that the idea that you can somehow freeze this conflict, the one in Ukraine, in the same way that the Korean conflict could be frozen, is based on a misconception. The Korean conflict in the early 1950s was frozen because the three great powers, the Soviet Union, the United States and China, who were each supporting the two sides, the North Koreans and the South Koreans, came to an understanding with each other that prolonging the Korean War was in none of their interests. They'd each achieved what they could achieve from the war. The United States had ensured the survival of South Korea. China had ensured the survival of North Korea. And the Soviets, for their part, had stabilized the situation in the Far East and at that time secured their alliance with China. And as this author of this article also correctly says, the Soviets, moreover and in addition, following the death of Stalin, had become less interested in using the Korean War to distract and drain support from the United States. In fact, over the following years, the Soviets actually saw some degree of rapprochement with the United States, but that's a discussion for another time. So the Korean War was frozen because of a general consensus that it should be frozen, reached by the great powers of that period. The same is not true in terms of the Ukraine war. First of all, Russia is not analogous to North Korea, especially not the North Korea of the 1950s. It is itself a great power. It is in a partnership with China, but it is not at all clear that China has the influence to get the Russians to agree to a freeze. And it's not clear either why the Chinese would want to influence the Russians to agree to a freeze. So all comparisons of the situation with the Korean War and the successful freeze of the Korean War are based on misconceptions. They don't appreciate the differences between the two wars. But then this article takes head on many of the illusions that still exist in the West, including in the United States, including within the Biden administration, including amongst Western governments, and, by the way, in Ukraine itself, about the state of the war. It says this: It is an error to characterize the war as a stalemate based purely on the observation that little territory is changing hands. In a war of attrition, the aim is to exhaust the enemy and force them to agree to terms. Territory gained is far from the main indicator of success. Military achievement can also be measured in the quantity of men and materials destroyed. In that regard, Ukraine has just given up an unsuccessful offensive that incurred heavy manpower and equipment losses. Ukrainian manpower is running low, and Zelensky is considering a new mobilization that would surely strain the country's economic capacity and morale. Ukraine's civilians face a harsh winter during which Russia is certain to target the energy system once again. Well, we'll see whether they do in fact do that. If they do, as Shoigu has told us, they have many more missiles with which to do it. Anyway, to continue. Furthermore, Ukraine's Western backers are struggling to keep up with the regular munition supplies as well as other items such as drones and armoured vehicles. US backing is likely to be disrupted due to the collapse of bipartisan support for funding and new demands from the Middle East. Meanwhile, Russian military production in artillery and drones, the bread and butter of this war, is not only sufficient but also supplemented by purchases of Iranian drones and North Korean shells. Well, I've just discussed what Shoigu has to say about the state of Russian military production, and for the record, I see no reason at all to doubt Shoigu's numbers. And then the article goes on to say, Russian losses, often wildly exaggerated, are at least 35,780, according to MediaZona, which has tracked the number of volunteers based on open source data. New recruitment drives have brought around 335,000 volunteers into the Russian army since January 2023, reducing the need for a second mobilization. That number, 335,000, is probably out of date now. Our last figure I saw was 350,000. Most likely, it'll be 420,000 by year end. And then the article continues, while the Russian military is set to reach 750,000 personnel, the Russian economy grows with little sign of elite or mass discontent inside the country. Its current operation in Avdeyevka is reminiscent of the Battle of Bakhmut, a Russian victory that got little attention in the West, but serves as a model of their slow, grinding, but successful approach to attritional warfare. The above picture is far from a stalemate. In fact, a new level of NATO intervention may soon be required to secure a stalemate and avert Ukrainian defeat. Now, is that likely? Are we indeed going to get that NATO intervention sufficient to secure a stalemate or avert a Ukrainian defeat? The article has already spoken about the fact that the bipartisan consensus in the United States has broken down. It has spoken about the fact that the United States is becoming distracted by events in the Middle East, and not just the Middle East, by the way. Lots of problems the United States is now facing. Around the world also, the article talks about the difficulties the West is encountering in keeping up with needs, the material needs of the war, in terms of ammunition and production of military equipment. So are we really likely to get a new level of NATO intervention? And of course, if by NATO intervention, what is being spoken about is direct NATO military intervention on the ground in Ukraine, I can say for an absolute fact that the support for that amongst Western publics, including indeed the American public, does not exist at all. And the article goes on to say that Russia is obviously not in the same position as of dependence that North Korea was in relation to the USSR in the 1950s. And then it says this: Moscow has far more space for independent action. The West may well pressure Ukraine to negotiate, but Kiev would be likely to resist. The absence of Western soldiers on the front line is a major difference to South Korea and complicates any attempt to twist Kiev's arm. Russia appears ready to fight on for years until it has a direct line to Washington or has achieved the collapse of the Ukrainian state. And there you have it. There you have the key point, the key understanding which Western commentators and political leaders appear to be missing. That for the Russians, the possibility of a negotiated settlement with Ukraine is hardly an option anymore. They tried to achieve it last year in February and March. The attempt to achieve that negotiated settlement with Ukraine was sabotaged by the Western powers. And besides, by this point, Russian concerns have expanded beyond Ukraine itself. Given the trajectory of travel in the war, if there is going to be a negotiated settlement, from a Russian point of view, it is not going to be one with Ukraine. It has to be one with the United States, and that means that it must extend to the general security situation in Europe. And the article goes on to say correctly that the Russians nowadays are not going to be interested in NATO-style security guarantees being given to Ukraine or anything of that nature. They will wait at the very least for Washington to prod Ukraine into a different stance that accepts some form of demilitarization and neutrality, an outcome that the Biden administration may delay until after the presidential election. The point is that if there's going to be negotiations to end this conflict at all, they have to be between the United States and Russia. The Russians will want, as I said, wider guarantees, certainly than they were prepared to accept in March. Almost certainly, and here I'm going beyond the article, they will want to return to the topic of the guarantees, the draft treaties that they sent to the United States and NATO in December 2021, and nothing less will do. And if they don't get that negotiation with the United States, they have no incentive not to press on until the Ukrainian state itself collapses. And they then decide to reorder the map of Ukraine as suits their interests best. Now, it seems to me that this article contains great sense, and it then goes on to make the only recommendation which, to my mind, makes any sense at all. It says, basically, forget about freezing the conflict. Forget about ceasefires. Forget about hopes that you can change the situation on the ground. The only thing that you can realistically do is to accept that the war is going on, but negotiate with the Russians now. And it talks about we must guard against, this is again from the article, lazy and complacent commentary on freezing the conflict. The war is not a stalemate and further escalations are likely. The lesson of the Korean War suggests starting talks now is beneficial, even if there is little likelihood of a deal in immediate terms. While many voices will denounce such negotiations as appeasement or treachery, this process needs to be initiated to clarify the difficult points and elaborate on how the aims of each side can be accommodated. And then eventually maybe some kind of settlement might be achieved. He talks about a fragile and flawed ceasefire, especially like one, Korea, being preferable to increased destabilization of Europe and further destruction and death in Ukraine. But basically, he says, start negotiations now. Forget about immediate ceasefires. Put aside illusions about freezing the conflict. Pick up the phone. Start talking to the Russians. Begin a process of dialogue and see where it goes. Maybe through that process of negotiation, which could be tough and prolonged, you might find yourself in a situation where each side feels that they're making progress in the negotiations. And at that point, some kind of ceasefire might be imposed on the Ukrainians. And perhaps you can then move beyond that ceasefire to some kind of general settlement as well. But even if you can't achieve that, well, a ceasefire, one based on Russian terms, but with some understandings between the Americans and the Russians of what the respective interests of each side are, is better than just sitting back, trying to cajole the Ukrainians into discussions with the Russians about freezing the conflict on the premise that there is a stalemate in place when that self-evidently is not the case. As you will have appreciated, this article has to be extremely careful about its language. Nowhere does it actually speak about a Ukrainian military defeat as the likeliest outcome, though it does mention the possibility of the collapse of the Ukrainian state, and it does float the possibility of talks resulting in some kind of armistice or ceasefire, presumably on Russian terms, even though one senses that the author probably doesn't really believe in that and understands that the Russians, if they're going to engage in a negotiation at all, will be looking for something much more substantial and long-term than that. But his key point, start negotiations now. Forget about ceasefires. Forget about trying to get the Ukrainians to talk about ceasefires. That makes absolute, overwhelming, compelling sense. And it is refreshing to see that there are some people in the United States who understand it. Now, what this person, Mr. Blackburn, is in a sense recommending is not Matthew Blackburn, is not the Korean variant, it is the Vietnam variant. The Paris peace talks got underway during the Vietnam War between the United States and North Vietnam. South Vietnam was not directly involved. The Paris peace talks got underway, even as the fighting in Vietnam, continued basically unabated. And he's saying that you have to face the facts that is the only realistic way forward that you have. Will anybody in the West, will any of the political leaders of the West adopt this wise counsel? I see no sign of it. President Zelensky himself has given an interview to The Sun, a British tabloid, which, by the way, has a shrinking readership, so I understand, and has long since lost the political traction that it used to have in British politics, something which perhaps President Zelensky and his advisors have not understood. But anyway, President Zelensky, over the course of that interview, again ruled out negotiations with the Russians. He continued to talk about the war, continuing until some kind of victory is achieved. He didn't explain how that victory would be achieved. He admitted that the situation of the Ukrainian military is difficult. He complained about the politicization of part of the Ukrainian military, which was interesting, and basically confirmed that his relationship with some of the Ukrainian commanders, General Zaluzhny first and foremost, has all but collapsed, and that he's worried that they might make a political strike against him. He has, by the way, just got round to sacking the head of the general who was in charge of Ukraine's military medical services. She was one of the three generals that there were rumours would be sacked a few days ago. She wasn't sacked. There was, as I've discussed in previous programmes, there appears to have been some pushback. But anyway, she survived. But now she has been sacked. The other two generals that were talked about then, Tarnavsky and the commander of the forces in the north, they're still in post. But it looks as if Zelensky is still determined to clear out the generals as soon as he can. He's presumably talked about all of this with Pistorius and Austin and Burns during their visits to Kiev. And no doubt we will see more military sackings before long. And I, for one, would not be in the slightest bit surprised. In fact, I strongly expect that Zaluzhny himself will be out of the picture soon. But anyway, no sign of negotiations coming from Zelensky. As I've said previously, I personally have lost all belief that Ukraine at the moment, the Kiev government at the moment, is in any condition to conduct negotiations. The United States could, in theory, conduct negotiations in the way that Matthew Blackburn talks about, and those negotiations logically ought to start now, but there's no sign of them. And to be frank, I don't think they're going to happen, at least whilst President Biden and his team remain in place, which, of course, leaves open the possibility that the war will continue for another year, with Ukraine getting weaker and weaker throughout that time, with more Ukrainian soldiers being killed, more damage being done to Ukraine every day, the economy coming under severe strain, the political crisis in Kiev perhaps at some point boiling over, or the alternative, that the Russian sledgehammer will finally fall and we will see Ukraine fall apart sometime before the end of the year, next year, and perhaps before the elections. I remember that some months ago, Abdi Alaudinov, the Chechen commander of the Chechen forces in the zone of the special military operation. He said that by his estimate, the war would probably end sometime around August 2024. That would be the point where Ukraine became exhausted and when the Russian forces became too overwhelming for Ukraine to exist. And at the moment, that seems to me as good a trajectory or a time estimate as any. Anyway, there we are. We shall see how things go. I also remember that another Russian general, by the way, predicted Ukraine's collapse. He was a regular army general. I've forgotten his name. But that he predicted a Ukrainian collapse in the spring of 2024. And it might also be, if we are frank, as soon as that, perhaps shortly after the Russian March presidential elections. Anyway, there we are. That is the situation. That is my update today about the war in Ukraine. The Russians are now pushing harder and harder on Avdeyevka. Every day they're making further advances. Every day the pincers around Avdeyevka close. At the rate that events are shaping out there, I doubt the Ukrainians will be able to hold on to Avdeyevka beyond the new year. Then who knows, maybe that's just an inexpert view. Maybe the Ukrainians will try and pull something back. And the situation of the Ukrainian forces in Kherson seems to be drastically deteriorating, even as the weather conditions start to turn against them. So that's the situation in Ukraine. Now, there is that other crisis going on, the one in the Middle East. And here we've had very important developments. Now, yesterday, we had the first confirmed, agreed humanitarian pause. And this follows exactly the trajectory of events that I expected and to a great extent predicted in the various programs that I have done about this conflict. And the humanitarian pause is only for 4 days. It's apparently a difficult sell by Prime Minister Netanyahu to his cabinet, but he did eventually get them to agree. So there's going to be a complete ceasefire for 4 days, lasting 4 days. Prime Minister Netanyahu says that after those 4 days, the fighting will resume. But my sense is that the fighting has already actually started to run down to some extent. And Hamas has agreed to release 50 of its hostages, principally women and children, but it will continue to hold on to around 190 more if the numbers of hostages that have been cited is correct. And interestingly, the Israelis have agreed on their part to release around 100 Palestinian prisoners that they've been holding. And I notice that some of them, in fact, all of them, from what I can understand, are said to be women and children. Now, I have to say, I find the last, especially, a rather concerning development, one which perhaps people in the West should note. It seems that Israel, in fact, it's been well known for a long time, that Israel has been detaining children, and there may be reasons for that. Some of these children might have been involved in who knows what sort of activities, but it's still disturbing to hear that children are being held in detention. And from what I understand also, it seems that these women and children have been detained without being put through any proper legal process at all, or so I understand. But anyway, the political point behind all of this is that part of the objective that Hamas said it had when it launched its attack on the 7th of October on southern Israel was to take hostages in order to achieve the release of Palestinian prisoners. And it has now partially, at least, achieved that. And it's also achieved a humanitarian pause, ceasefire. It's only for 4 days, but it's a pause. It is still there. Its organization is still intact, and it will be hoping and perhaps even expecting that more pauses and eventually a ceasefire might be achieved as well. Now, this humanitarian pause, we are being told, was brokered by Egypt and Qatar, but it's also clear that there was intense pressure on Israel to agree to it from the United States. And we read in The Guardian, the pressure on Netanyahu and Israel's war cabinet from the United States has been growing steadily in recent weeks, as President Biden has faced growing disquiet among Democratic Party supporters and the US public in general about the civilian toll in Gaza. And I also read, I think it was the Daily Telegraph, that they also spoke about how the United States has been piling on the pressure on the Israelis to agree to this prisoner swap, this hostage prisoner swap, and this humanitarian ceasefire, and that the pressure became particularly intense over the weekend, and that President Biden himself was becoming involved, and that messages were being sent to Israel from the White House, pushing for this pause and ceasefire on an almost hourly basis, a level of pressure that, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet could not in the end fully withstand. And yes, probably at the end of the 4 days, the fighting will resume. But my own sense is that the fighting anyway in Gaza has been taking place at a somewhat reduced level. And I am starting to see, even in some establishment places in the United States, media outlets, more criticisms of Israel starting to appear. And there's been an article, for example, in the National Interest by Paul Pilar about the Al-Shifa hospital situation. And it says that the Israelis have been working hard to confirm, to provide clear-cut evidence that the hospital was indeed being used by Hamas as a military command center and fortified position. And so far, that evidence has not been sufficient to convince the doubters. Now, I'm reading this from the National Interest. The evidence that Israel has come up with, besides that hole in the ground, appears to consist chiefly of a few rifles and rifle parts that were reportedly found in a storage closet by the MRI room, along with a bullet vest, some Qurans, some dates, and a few other items. Nothing presented so far comes close to having the appearance of a Hamas command center, and nothing comes close to the kind of military use of the hospital that would clearly justify an exception to the long-standing prohibition in international law against attacking medical facilities. invoking that exception would require that Hamas was actively using the premises to attack Israeli forces, such as by firing rockets or artillery rounds from the hospital's grounds. And that article, by the way, appeared on the 20th of November in the National Interest. As I said, it's by Paul Pillar. Those are Paul Pillar's words, they're not mine. So we are seeing criticisms as well. And inevitably, this is going to feed in to more demands for more ceasefires. And interestingly enough, President Putin of Russia participated yesterday in an extraordinary BRICS summit. And the BRICS summit brought together, and it was a virtual summit, President Lula of Brazil, President Xi Jinping of China. He has been very active, by the way, in communicating with the Russians over the last couple of days, ever since he returned to China from the United States following his meeting with President Biden. And he's been sending messages to Russia confirming the strength of the China-Russia relationship. But we see that he's now also participated in this virtual summit, this virtual BRICS summit. And Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa also participated. Prime Minister Modi of India did not participate. India was represented by its extremely capable Foreign Minister, Subramanian Jaishankar. Prime Minister Modi has been more sympathetic to Israel in respect of this conflict, has been more aligned with Israel over the course of this conflict than the other BRICS states. But we see that even though he was reluctant to participate himself, nonetheless, he did send his foreign minister, and the foreign minister did take part. So we've had Putin, Xi Jinping, Lula, and Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa. And there were others who participated in this virtual summit as well. And they included President El-Sisi of Egypt, President Raisi of Iran, MBS, the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the President of the UAE, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy, and of course there was the Foreign Minister of Argentina, which is still looking at, well, he was presumably representing the previous government, the one that has just lost the election, so it's unlikely we'll be getting the Argentinians involved in these sort of discussions any longer. But anyway, President Putin himself gave a speech. So, of course, did the other leaders. The most important takeaway from this meeting is that they were speaking about the urgency of a full ceasefire. I'm going to quote from what Putin said. He said that it's worth noting that all BRICS countries, including India, have similar positions on the need to collectively reach long-term and durable settlement of the long-standing Palestinian-Israeli problem. This is reflected during the voting on the draft resolution on a humanitarian truce at the UN General Assembly. That was the Arab-sponsored resolution, which of course passed, and in discussing a UN Security Council resolution on the Middle East settlement process, which is adopted for the first time in the past 7 years. Although this resolution contains merely an appeal for humanitarian pauses rather than a full ceasefire, we consider the very fact of its approval a step in the right direction. I would like to emphasize that humanitarian pauses and, better still, a full ceasefire are essential to continue the efforts to free hostages and evacuate civilians and foreigners. By all accounts, the most urgent goal is to reach a truly long-term and sustainable truce. And I'm sure that that will be the priority at the moment. And apparently there were a lot of proposals made by South Africa in particular, and the thinking seems to be that there will be a peacekeeping force sent to Gaza, but that it will be one that will be put together ultimately by the BRICS states. South Africa has apparently indicated that it might be willing to participate in the setting up of that force. We shall see whether or not that happens. But anyway, discussions on these lines are taking place. And look again at who is participating in this process. All the big players, Lula, Putin, Xi Jinping, the Indian government, Raisi of Iran, MBS, Al-Sisi, the president of the UAE, and the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and of course the President of South Africa as well. The center of gravity in Middle East diplomacy is shifting away from the United States. Egypt and Qatar brokered the agreement for this latest humanitarian pause. They brokered the agreement that took place. President Al-Sisi will have briefed the other BRICS leaders about all of this over the course of this virtual summit meeting. They're talking now about moving on towards a full humanitarian ceasefire. The South Africans are broaching ideas for a peacekeeping force in Gaza, and they all appear to be agreed that once this immediate conflict is ended, they have to be moves also to put the entire process of achieving a long-term, sustainable resolution of this crisis between Palestinians and Israelis, that process finally must get underway. And of course, Putin had things to say about this. He said that the situation is the product, the failure, the breakdown is the product of the United States' aspiration to monopolize the mediating role in the Palestinian-Israeli settlement process and block the activities of the Middle East Quartet of international mediators. This is history's way of demonstrating that attempts to single-handedly cut the Palestinian knot are unviable and counterproductive because of the sabotage of UN decisions which clearly call for the establishment and peaceful coexistence of two independent sovereign states, Israel and Palestine. More than one generation of Palestinians has grown up in an atmosphere of injustice, and Israelis cannot fully guarantee the security of their state either. Russia's stance is consistent and independent of momentary conditions. We urge the international community to join efforts aimed at de-escalating the situation, negotiating a ceasefire, and achieving a peaceful solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The BRICS states and the countries in the region can play a key role in this work. So, in summary, we're going to see over the next couple of days concerted efforts to turn these humanitarian pauses into a ceasefire, a proper, durable ceasefire, Hamas will continue to exist in Gaza, and it will continue to, and it will be able to say that it has at least engineered the release of Palestinian prisoners. But there does seem to be, on the part of the BRICS states, a desire to look beyond Hamas and perhaps the present Israeli government and indeed the United States. They're talking of sending peacekeeping forces to Gaza, and they're talking about wresting control of the diplomatic process in the Middle East from the hands of the United States. More ceasefire resolutions are going to head soon in the direction of the Security Council. Before long, we are going to get a resolution that calls for a ceasefire, and which the United States is going to find it very difficult to block. And beyond that still, that resolution will probably contain provisions for a peacekeeping force, and it is likely that it will be put together by regional countries and also by the BRICS states. And last but not least, it is likely also that very soon we're going to have more resolutions proposed and passing through the United Nations, setting up the International Peace Conference that the Chinese have been talking about, and the Arab states, the Arab and Muslim states, are now backing, and which will transfer away control of the mediation process from the Americans. That's the direction of events, and it seems to me that it is increasingly becoming irresistible. In the meantime, I'm going to finish this program by saying that Putin is now attending yet another meeting, virtual meeting today, which will involve many of the same participants. And this is going to be a G20 meeting. And interestingly enough, it's been convened by India. It's another virtual summit meeting. I presume Prime Minister Modi this time will participate. So in theory should the Western powers. And if Putin is going to be involved, and the Russian authorities have confirmed he will be, it will be the first virtual meeting attended by the Western powers in which Putin is virtually present, that we have seen, be the first, in effect, contact by the Western powers with Putin himself. It will be interesting to see which, if any, Western leaders take part. But that is a topic for further discussion tomorrow. Anyway, this is where I end this program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can find you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and see the amazing things that we have there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. Have a very good day.